It wasn't consumer preference. It wasn't the invisible hand of the market. It wasn't even government regulation. It was the quiet, methodical positioning of a few families who understood that he who controls the logistics of calories controls the population. Walk down any supermarket aisle in London, New York, Berlin, Tokyo. You see thousands of brands, bright colors, competing logos, promises of organic purity or convenient speed. It looks like a chaotic, vibrant ecosystem of choice. It looks like freedom. But if you look at the balance sheets, the ownership structures, and the patent filings, the chaos vanishes. The variety is an illusion. The competition is theater. Behind the endless rows of cardboard and plastic, the architecture of the global food supply is held by a shockingly small number of hands. And a disproportionate number of those hands belong to a tight-knit circle of dynasties from a small, frozen country in northern Europe, Sweden. We are not talking about the farmers who grow the wheat. We are not talking about the chefs who cook the meals. We are talking about the invisible layer in between, the packaging that preserves the food, the industrial machinery that processes it, the logistical networks that move it, the banking structures that finance it. This is an empire built not on land, but on the choke points of civilization. Most observers agree that without the specific technologies and supply chains owned by these Swedish industrial spheres, the modern urban food system would collapse within 48 hours. The arithmetic is merciless. The dependency is absolute. This isn't prophecy. It's positioning under constraints. To understand how a country of 10 million people came to dominate the unseen infrastructure of what 7 billion people eat, we have to look at the historical pattern. We have to look at how capital reacts when the world becomes unstable. We have to look at 3 specific case files where these families saw constraint, identified the incentive, and moved their capital before the rest of the world understood the game. Case file 1 begins in 1951, Lund, Sweden. The world is rebuilding from the ashes of the Second World War. Europe is hungry. Urbanization is exploding. Populations are flooding from the countryside into the cities, and this created a massive biological constraint. The constraint was spoilage. How do you get fresh milk, a staple of the Western diet, from a cow in a rural pasture to a tenement apartment in a crowded city without it rotting? At the time, the distribution radius of fresh food was limited by the speed of the delivery truck and the lifespan of the bacteria. Glass bottles were heavy. They were fragile. They had to be returned, washed, and sterilized. The logistics were a nightmare of broken glass and sour milk. The incentive was clear. Whoever could break the biological clock of food spoilage would own the urbanization of the planet. Enter Reuben Rousing. He was not a farmer. He was an industrialist who understood the geometry of efficiency. He didn't try to breed a better cow. He didn't try to build faster trucks. He looked at the packaging. His solution was a tetrahedron, a 3-sided pyramid of paper coated in plastic, filled continuously through a tube. It required no air. It required no refrigeration during transport if the milk was treated. It was the birth of Tetra Pak. Think about the scale of this shift. Before this innovation, food was local. After this innovation, food was global. The Rousing family didn't just sell a carton. They sold a system. They leased the machines that filled the cartons. They supplied the material that made the cartons. They owned the intellectual property that defined how liquid nutrition moved across the surface of the earth. By the 1960s and 70s, as the developing world began to industrialize, they needed to feed their growing cities. They didn't have cold chains. They didn't have fleets of refrigerated trucks. But they had Tetra Pak. The Rousing Empire expanded into Mexico, into Brazil, into the Soviet Union. They became the silent partner in the global caloric intake. Today, the Tetra Laval Group, still controlled by the descendants of Reuben Rousing, is one of the largest private companies in the world. They process and package billions of liters of food every single day. When you buy juice in Jakarta, milk in Moscow, or soup in San Francisco, you are paying a toll to a Swedish dynasty that solved the logistics constraints 70 years ago. They positioned themselves at the bottleneck. The risk was spoilage. The payoff was a royalty on human survival. But packaging is only the skin of the system. To control the flow, you need to control the machinery inside the factory. This brings us to Case File 2, the 1970s. The era of the Great Inflation. The oil shocks. The world was reeling from a crisis of energy and cost. Industrial margins were being crushed. Labor was expensive. Energy was expensive. The constraint was efficiency. Food processing plants could no longer afford to be labor-intensive operations. They needed automation. They needed scale. They needed to turn the processing of grain, meat, and dairy into a seamless, high-speed industrial process. While the rest of the world was panicking about oil prices, the Wallenberg sphere was positioning itself. The Wallenberg family is the closest thing the modern world has to the Medici. Through their investment vehicle, Investor AB, they hold controlling stakes in a vast swath of the Nordic industrial base. During the turbulence of the 70s and 80s, they didn't retreat. They consolidated. They doubled down on the companies that made the machines. Companies like Atlas Copco, companies like ABB, companies that build the compressors, the motors, the robotics, and the power systems that keep a modern food factory running. You cannot run a slaughterhouse without compressed air. You cannot run a bottling plant without industrial robotics. You cannot run a mesmerizingly complex global supply chain without the heavy engineering that these companies provide. The Wallenberg strategy was not to own the farm. Farms are risky. Weather is unpredictable. Crop prices fluctuate. The Wallenberg strategy was to own the pickaxes and shovels of the industrial food age. They bought the engineering capacity that every food giant Nestle, Unilever, Kraft relies on. The incentive was durability. Brands come and go. Diets change. But the need for industrial efficiency is a constant. By owning the infrastructure of production, they ensured that regardless of what brand is on the label, the machinery creating it pays a dividend to Stockholm. This is the principle of the toll booth. You don't care where the car is going. You just want to ensure it has to pay to cross the bridge. Under these constraints, the rational move was to monopolize the technology of efficiency. Then came the third shift. Case File 3, the financial crisis of 2008 to the present. The era of zero interest rate policy. Asset inflation. The digitization of everything. The constraint here was yield. Capital was free, but safe returns were hard to find. At the same time, the world began to wake up to the fragility of the supply chain. Climate shocks, geopolitical tension. The old models of simply shipping raw commodities were becoming risky. The new constraint is resilience and data. The modern Swedish billionaire class, the heirs to the Rausing, Persson, and Kamprad fortunes, along with the newer tech oligarchs, began a quiet pivot. They stopped just selling boxes and machines. They began buying the biology and the data. Look at the investment portfolios of firms like Kinnevik or EQT, the private equity giant born from the Wallenberg sphere. They are aggressively moving into food tech, into indoor farming, into synthetic biology, into the testing and safety certification of food. Why? Because the next bottleneck isn't packaging. It isn't even processing. It's verification and origin. As supply chains break down and food fraud increases, the entity that can certify that a piece of meat is safe or that a grain is pathogen-free holds the keys to the market. We see the Kamprad family, through the Inter-IKEA group, becoming a massive player not just in furniture, but in food logistics and sustainable sourcing. IKEA is one of the largest food retailers in the world by volume, a fact often overlooked. They are vertically integrating supply chains to ensure they can sell a meatball at a price that defies inflation. To do that, you have to own the chain. You have to own the data. You have to position yourself against the volatility of the open market. The move since 2008 has been to capture the intellectual property of food production itself, the seeds, the digital tracking systems, the lab-grown alternatives. They are hedging against nature itself. The incentive is to remove the variable of weather and replace it with the certainty of a laboratory and a spreadsheet. Here's the key. None of this is done in the open. These families do not put their names on the front of the cereal box. They do not appear in commercials. They operate through holding companies, foundations, investment trusts with boring names. They understand that visibility is a liability. If you control the water supply, you don't want people to know your name. You just want them to pay the bill. This structure, the foundation-owned industrial empire, is a specific feature of Swedish capitalism. It allows for multi-generational planning. A CEO of a public American company worries about the next quarter. The chairman of a Swedish foundation worries about the next quarter century. This duration mismatch allows them to eat up competitors who are forced to think short-term. It allows them to wait out crises. It allows them to compound power while others are liquidating assets to survive. The constraint engine that drives this dominance is composed of three parts: liquidity, duration, and inflation risk. First, liquidity. These families sit on massive piles of cash generated by their legacy monopolies. When a crisis hits like 2008 or the pandemic of 2020 and credit markets freeze, they become the buyers of last resort. They buy distressed assets in the food sector for pennies on the dollar. Second, duration. Because they are often private or controlled by voting shares, they do not have to answer to activist investors. They can invest in a logistics network that won't turn a profit for 10 years. Third, inflation risk. They know that in a world of printing money, hard assets and essential services are the only hedge. People can stop buying new cars. People can stop buying new clothes. They cannot stop eating. By anchoring their wealth in the processing and packaging of food, they have created an inflation-protected bond that pays out in calories. Some economic historians note that this concentration of power is dangerous. They argue that relying on a handful of Nordic conglomerates for the machinery and packaging of the global food supply creates a single point of failure. If a cyber attack hits the digital systems of these logistics giants, the shelves go empty. If a trade war cuts off the supply of spare parts for the processing machines, the factories stop. The counter-argument from the industry is always efficiency. They claim that only through this scale can we feed 8 billion people at current prices. They claim that fragmentation would lead to higher costs and more waste, but the incentives suggest otherwise. The incentive of a monopoly is never to lower prices for the consumer. The incentive is to maximize the extraction of value from the chain. Under these constraints, the rational move for these conglomerates is to squeeze the farmers on one end and the consumers on the other, keeping the surplus for the infrastructure owners. Current data suggests this is exactly what is happening. Food prices are rising faster than input costs. Farmers are going bankrupt, while the processors and packagers post record profits. The margin is moving to the middle. The margin is moving to Sweden. We are now seeing the pattern repeat in 7 distinct stages. Stage 1. Innovation. A new technology solves a critical constraint, like the Tetra Pak carton or the automated separator. Stage 2. Adoption. The technology becomes the industry standard. Competitors are bought out or die. Stage 3. Dependency. The market reshapes itself around this standard. Cities are built assuming milk can travel for weeks. Factories are designed around specific Swedish machines. Stage 4. Consolidation. The winners use their cash flow to buy adjacent industries. Packaging buys processing. Processing buys logistics. Stage 5. Extraction. The market is captured. Prices for the service begin to rise. Innovation slows down. The focus shifts to rent-seeking. Stage 6. Financialization. The physical assets are leveraged to buy into the next wave of technology, biotech, data, synthetic food. Stage 7. Total integration. The system becomes too big to fail. Governments cannot regulate it because the supply of food depends on it. The private empire becomes a public utility, but without public oversight. Just like the Roman landholders who absorbed the small farms during the crisis of the 3rd century. Just like the British trading houses that monopolized the tea and spice routes. The pattern is unmistakable. We are currently transitioning between Stage 6 and Stage 7. The old industrial monopolies are financializing their power to capture the future of food tech. The warning signs are visible in the consolidation of grocery retail, the standardization of packaging laws, and the push for digital tracking of all agricultural inputs. What are the endgames? History suggests 3 possibilities. The first is controlled decline. The monopolies maintain their grip, but the cost of food rises steadily relative to wages. Quality decreases. Sizes shrink. The Tetra Pak model of efficiency is used to ration calories. We see this in the phenomenon of shrinkflation. This is a managed reduction in the standard of living to protect the margins of the infrastructure owners. An example of this is the slow erosion of diet quality in the Western world since the 1970s, masked by better packaging and marketing. The second endgame is chaotic collapse. The supply chains become too complex and brittle. A shock war, a new pandemic, a massive energy crisis breaks the logistical links. Because the system is so centralized, the failure is catastrophic. The machines stop because the software update from Stockholm didn't come through. The packaging runs out because the paper pulp supply from a single forest was cut off. This leads to shortages, panic, and the localization of food systems out of necessity. We saw a glimpse of this in the early days of the 2020 lockdowns, where efficient, just-in-time systems failed overnight. The third endgame is reset and restructure, the most likely outcome. The billionaires use the crisis to introduce a new system. This likely involves the integration of food logistics with central bank digital currencies and digital ID. To access the efficient global food network, you must be part of the digital control grid. The Swedish model of a cashless, high-trust, high-tech society becomes the template for the world. The families who own the infrastructure become the architects of the new rationing system. They trade their commercial dominance for political indispensability. This happened in the 1940s, when industrial giants became arms of the state war effort. The incentive is survival and continuity of the dynasty. The only variable is timing and pain. For the average person, this is not a call to boycott. It is impossible to boycott the infrastructure of the modern world. You cannot avoid the packaging, the logistics, or the banking systems that sit behind your food. But you can understand the terrain. You can understand that cheap food is a historical anomaly created by these specific efficiencies. And you can understand that as these families pivot to protect their wealth, the era of cheap, abundant choice is likely ending. Education is the only hedge. Understanding the supply chain is the only defense. Resilience starts with knowing who owns the bottleneck. Subscribe to follow the money. Watch the data, not the headlines. The map is changing, and the architects are not waiting for your permission.